Hello, my name is James, and I'm going to discuss the construct of motivation within an organizational context. I'll begin with an introduction to motivation, and then discuss why it's important in an organizational context more broadly. In contrast to a trait, motivation is a state and explains why individuals experience emotional arousal toward or take action toward a particular action. Motivation may be understood in terms of arousal, direction, intensity, and persistence. Because motivation is essential for organizational tasks to be completed, organizations highly value facilitating motivation within their own employees.
I'd like to start today by inspiring you.
Moreover, feelings of accomplishment for an employee can only be authentic if the employee actually accomplished a task, which of course requires motivation. Thus, motivation is an important factor for organizations and employees alike. But let's briefly review motivation before diving into the main theories. Key points about motivation to remember are: first, motivation is facilitated by both work setting, such as social relatedness in teams, and individual difference variables. Second, motivation is associated with other variables, including job satisfaction, counterproductive work behaviors, and not surprisingly, performance. And third, theories of motivation come in different forms, such as those that can be applied both to organizational contexts, such as job characteristics theory, and Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which might be applied in more non-organizational contexts as well. But let's first look at the main theory of motivation that we'll look at in this video, which is self-determination theory from Ryan and DC. It consists of several sub-theories, such as basic needs theory and cognitive evaluation theory. Basic needs theory suggests that three variables, autonomy, competence, and social relatedness, help facilitate overall well-being and motivation. Explaining the relationship of basic needs theory to motivation via cognitive evaluation theory helps explain the relationship between intrinsic motivation and external factors such as feedback and rewards. Autonomy and competence are the two main components of CET, or cognitive evaluation theory. DC also found positive feedback increased intrinsic motivation.
And this animation will be a quick example that illustrates this principle well.
I noticed your productivity increased recently after you were given a raise. I'm happy to see your productivity increase, but I hope it isn't short-lived because it correlates with more money.
Yes, sir. It was a direct result of receiving the Employee of the Month award.
In this animation, the Employee of the Month award was an example of positive feedback. Positive feedback increases feelings of confidence, which, as mentioned, is one of the three components of facilitating intrinsic motivation.
Moreover, intrinsic motivation requires that the person perceives her behavior as self-caused rather than being externally controlled.
And being externally controlled rather than intrinsically motivated is demonstrated almost perfectly in this example from pop culture. So that means that when I make a mistake, I have 8 different people coming by to tell me about it. That's my only real motivation, is not to be hassled.
Moreover, rewards can actually reduce intrinsic motivation, as the individual will perceive her behavior as being externally controlled rather than internal. Last, intrinsic motivation is facilitated by a secure feeling of social belonging. Organismic integration theory is another sub-theory of self-determination theory, which suggests that there are different forms of extrinsic motivation, some of which are more internalized and thus more self-determined. These go in the order of external regulation or extrinsic motivation, introjected regulation, identified regulation, and integrated regulation. This means that a person has fully internalized a motive or outcome as their own. The more autonomy, competence, and social relatedness that individuals feel, the more extrinsic motivation will become integrated within the self. Self-determination theory has also been found to be generalizable across generations. For instance, Haynes and Kerr examined whether there are motivation-related differences between workers from the millennial generation and Generation X. There was one significant difference found, which is that millennials perceived greater autonomy in the work they did compared to Generation X participants. But the effect sizes were very small, and thus the findings had little practical significance. There were no other differences between the two groups regarding other motivation variables such as intrinsic or extrinsic motivation. However, SDT is just one of many theories of motivation. So we will now examine several other theories that are popular in the scholarly literature, as well as some examples of how these theories supplement one another. Per Locke and Latham's recommendation to integrate existing theories of motivation, I will attempt to give examples of how such extant models corroborate and add to each other. Maslow's hierarchy of needs suggests that humans are motivated to fulfill each successive layer, as each layer is fulfilled starting from the bottom of the hierarchy, with what Maslow considered the most essential for survival. It is easy to see immediate overlap in that one component of SDT, social relatedness, fits comfortably into the social acceptance layer of Maslow's hierarchy. However, Maslow's hierarchy also adds to SDT, especially in explaining workplace motivation in extreme cases. For instance, if someone just lost their house in a hurricane or just found out that they had cancer, they would not be motivated to work, or perhaps even arrive to work, because their more foundational needs would not have been met yet. Thus, though Maslow's hierarchy has little experimental support, it does add to SDT. Let's now look at Herzberg's two-factor model, or motivation hygiene theory of motivation, which is another theory of motivation that started in the 1950s. Though SDT does an excellent job of explicating the different forms of motivation ranging from fully extrinsic to intrinsic, Herzberg's model can be used to specify what extrinsic and intrinsic forms of motivation look like in the workplace in particular. This is because Herzberg's model is made of two major subcomponents, which are hygiene factors that reduce dissatisfaction and motivator factors, which increase job satisfaction. Hygiene factors such as pay and status are synonymous with what DC and Ryan refer to as extrinsic motivators, and motivator factors such as meaningful and challenging work are synonymous with intrinsic factors. This synthesis of theories helps understand SDT in a way that is clearly more organizational psychology related. However, though SDT helps us understand the different categories of motivation, we can still synthesize SDT with other theories of motivation in order to have a deeper comprehension of motivation in organizations. For instance, we might wonder how we could predict whether someone will pursue one of the particular extrinsic rewards mentioned above from Herzberg's two-factor model. In order to do this, we can incorporate Vroom's expectancy theory, also known as the valence instrumentality expectancy theory, or VI. The valence component of VI is a numerical value representing how much a reward, such as pay, is valued. Instrumentality is a numerical value representing the belief that once performing a certain action will earn a reward. And expectancy is a numerical value representing the belief that the appropriate performance can be achieved by one's effort and skill, kind of like self-efficacy. Though Vroom suggests that these three numerical values could be multiplied to give a total motivational force value, the research actually suggests that these three factors are better predictors of performance when they are kept separate. We thus have three predictors of whether one would be extrinsically motivated to perform a particular action in an organization. VI may be better understood when considering relevant individual difference variables. For example, Colquitt and Simmering discussed motivation in light of valence expectancy theory and motivation's relationship with the individual difference variable known as conscientiousness. There was a positive relationship between motivation and conscientiousness. Moreover, Colquitt and Simmering found individuals high in conscientiousness were more likely to perceive a link between effort and performance, which may explain their greater effort as being the result of greater expected performance or outcomes, according to value expectancy theory. Though VI gives a good explanation of extrinsic or instrumental types of motivation, it does not explain non-instrumental motivation, otherwise known as intrinsic motivation. Thus, in order to better explain how intrinsic motivation is facilitated specifically in an organizational context, we will now turn to job characteristics theory. Job characteristics theory explains how efforts and changing the job result in positive outcomes, such as intrinsic motivation. Job characteristics theory comprises 5 different core, job-specific dimensions that are most conducive for intrinsic motivation. These are actually divided in 3 categories more broadly.
These 3 broad dimensions are meeting facilitators, job autonomy, and feedback.
The first category of core job dimensions includes meaning facilitators such as skill variety used on the job, task identity, which is understanding what the final product of one's work is, and task significance, which is understanding how one's final product contributes to the organization as a whole. By facilitating the critical psychological state of experienced meaningfulness, these core job dimensions enable intrinsic motivation. The second core job dimension, job autonomy, engenders the second critical psychological state of feelings of responsibility for one's work, and in turn facilitates intrinsic motivation. The third core job dimension, feedback, for example, feedback on how one is performing, gives a worker the third critical psychological state, knowledge of their results, which spurs on intrinsic motivation as well. The model also recognizes growth, need, strength, which is one's desire to grow and succeed as an individual difference variable, and a moderator of the aforementioned relationships, which is positively associated with intrinsic motivation. Thus, we now have a broad synthesis of theories to understand motivation in a workplace context. However, a broad picture of organizational motivation is still missing a key component that is common in organizations and plausibly the most researched theory of motivation, goal-setting theory. Goal-setting theory recognizes that individuals are motivated by goals, and thus it recognizes that goal-setting is both an explanation of where motivation comes from, as well as a technique for carrying out motivation toward action. It may seem as though goal-setting theory does not add anything to the models that have been synthesized so far, since the top of Maslow's hierarchy, labeled self-actualization, already encapsulates goal-setting theory within it. However, because Maslow's hierarchy has little empirical support, goal-setting theory, which has strong empirical support, corroborates the use of goal-setting in explaining motivation. Goals that have the most motivational force must be specific, challenging, and accepted by the individual. Moreover, goal-setting theory is a cognitive-based theory of motivation. Thus, if cognitive functioning of individuals is impaired, such as by negative affect, goal-setting and motivation would likely be reduced. Judge and Wise conducted a meta-analysis on the association between motivation and the individual difference variables for the Big Five personality traits in particular, in the context of goal-setting theory, expectancy theory, and self-efficacy. Neuroticism and conscientiousness were found to best predict motivation across the three theories of motivation included. Additionally, extroversion was found to predict motivation on a consistent basis. The authors suggested this relationship may be due to extroversion's typical association with positive affect, which may allow extroverts to better focus on their goal setting. By contrast, neuroticism is speculated to interfere with motivation since negative affect behaviors such as anxiety plausibly interfere with behaviors such as goal setting. We'll now consider an analysis of how the different components of the synthesized motivational theories manifest in different organizational contexts, such as in socialization and teams. We'll begin with socialization, which is an ongoing process of individuals becoming calibrated, both task-wise and socially, with an ever-changing organization. During the socialization process, individuals experience orientation training, learning task characteristics, developing social support, and leadership, each of which is an example of motivation in a socialization context. In the Saxon-Grumman model of socialization, employees experience the following: orientation training to practice their skills and develop competence, which is one of the three basic needs of SDT. Learning task characteristics, which includes developing skill variety, and which is a component of the first category of the core job dimensions under job characteristics theory. And the last component is growing social support, such as interaction with peers and supervisors, and which is synonymous with relatedness within SDT. This relationship is supported by the finding by Chen, Chai, and Chen that public service motivation was positively associated with trust between leaders and colleagues. The next component of socialization is leadership. This is basically leadership from others, such as goal setting for the individual worker or teams, which is an example of goal setting theory in action. during the socialization process. The next topic from organizational psychology we will see interacts with motivation is the topic of job attitudes. We'll begin by viewing a component of job attitudes, job satisfaction, through the lens of a theory of motivation, Herzberg's two-factor model. As noted, Herzberg's two-factor model consists of hygiene factors, such as pay, that can potentially increase job dissatisfaction, and motivator factors, such as verbal encouragement, which potentially increase job satisfaction. If motivator factors increase job satisfaction, a positive relationship between these variables would be expected. Lambro, Kondimenopoulos, and Nikias tested for and found this predicted positive relationship among working medical professionals. Related to job satisfaction is job performance, both of which have been found to correlate with each other in past literature. We'll now examine the relationship between motivation and performance in organizations. Given that performance can be considered controlled, goal-related behavior, it fits well with organizational theories of motivation. Kondimenopoulos and Nikias have found in a sample of working medical professionals that motivation predicts job performance and theorize that motivation and job satisfaction work in conjunction to improve worker performance. Moreover, Yahyun, Lin, and Liu found motivation mediated the relationship between creative work culture and job performance. The authors suggested that when an organization's climate is more open to creativity, such as supervisors supporting more creative behaviors, employees perform better, such as becoming more innovative, because they feel greater autonomy and thus increased motivation toward their work. However, motivation does not just influence the performance of individuals, but also teams, which is the next component of organizational psychology we will examine in the context of motivation. Two theories of motivation that are intertwined with the concept of organizational teams are goal-setting theory and social determination theory. Tohidi reviewed findings in past literature regarding what factors are typically associated with greater motivation among teams. In particular, goal establishment is essential for teams by giving members a shared sense of direction. The most important aspect of team goals were that they were measurable, which may help counter potential perceptions of diffused responsibility among team members. Not surprisingly, goals that were formed by the team itself, rather than merely handed down to the team by a leader, were more motivating, since goals formed by the team itself increased feelings of autonomy, which Ryan and DC would predict assist intrinsic motivation. Okello and Gibson looked at what relational factors related to intrinsic motivation in literature published from 2003 to 2013. Relational factors such as trust between employees and their colleagues, managers, and supervisors predicted intrinsic motivation for health workers included in the study, as Ryan and DC would predict. Subfacets of the broader construct of perceived trust included respect, recognition, autonomy, and appreciation. In order for both teams and individuals to succeed, though, they need the appropriate amount of stress, which is the next topic we will cover within the context of motivation. Barney and Elias examined whether employees had less stress and greater motivation when they had more flexible schedules. For example, when employees could choose when to start and end their workday. Surprisingly, greater flex time was associated with greater extrinsic motivation and less stress, but not with intrinsic motivation. This is surprising because according to Ryan and DC, greater autonomy is typically associated with greater intrinsic motivation. However, Barney and Elias suggested that more extrinsic related benefits, such as flex time, may have little influence on intrinsically motivated workers' motivation, since intrinsically motivated employees are motivated by the work in and of itself rather than extrinsic benefits. Though teams can be self-managed, they often have a leader. Leadership is the next component of organizational psychology we'll examine within a motivation context. Similar to the concept of teams, goal-setting theory and SDT are heavily intertwined with the phenomena of leadership in organizations, as well as the job commands theory of motivation. Leadership in organizations refer to the behaviors that influential people in the organization have on others, such as identifying an organization's mission, values, and goals, communicating them to others, and consequently inspiring others to pursue those same values and goals. In their review article, Harlbarg and Lavina suggested that transformational leadership can help improve motivation of employees in several ways. In particular, transformational leaders will empower employees, which in turn increases feelings of autonomy and decision-making in employees, which Ryan and DC have suggested increase motivation. Moreover, transformational leaders are transparent in decision-making and goal setting, which will help allow employees understand how such goals are related to their interests and values, leading to greater motivation to achieve such goals. The transparent nature of communication by transformational leaders also improves task identity for workers. Given the importance of task identity as a core job dimension in the job characteristics theory, greater task identity produces increased perceptions of experience meaningfulness, a critical psychological state that leads to improved intrinsic motivation. Leaders and the motivation they have can be important in influencing the different cultures of organizations, which will be the next topic we will consider in its synthesis with motivation. Culture refers to how employees comprehend and make sense of their work environment, its history, and what behaviors are expected and rewarded in that work environment. A strong positive culture can help perpetuate norms and values that are conducive for motivation, such as relatedness and perceived autonomy. For example, Jerome suggested that an organization's culture needs to reflect that an employee's needs are of the highest importance in order to motivate employees to attempt to find fulfillment of those needs in the organization. Such a supportive culture would plausibly lead to greater social relatedness, which SDT would predict leads to greater intrinsic motivation. One component of an organization's culture includes its influence on behaviors. This, of course, may include interpersonal behavior. Okello and Gilson found relational factors that predicted intrinsic motivation for health workers included trust between employees and their colleagues, managers, and supervisors. Subfacets of the broader construct of perceived trust included respect, recognition, autonomy, appreciation, and other variables that may be cultivated through organizational culture and socialization. Thus, cultures that encourage relatedness will help facilitate an environment conducive for intrinsic motivation. Yet, as noted in the start of this video, motivation moves people to action, and action is most useful when it's strategic. We thus now turn to the topic of strategy in organizations and how it's properly understood in light of what we know about motivation. Given that strategy may be considered broadly as a plan, motivation may intertwine with strategy in many ways. One example of strategy might be to provide faster service to customers compared to competitors, and to use gamification to implement this plan. Boyer, Celestine, Scott Ladd, and Layton review the literature on gamification, which is an attempt at making workplace tasks more motivating by gamifying work tasks. Gamifying means making work tasks similar to digital games such as video or computer games, which can in turn enhance intrinsic motivation. This process may be understood through different theories of motivation, such as job characteristics theory. One example of gamification includes providing digital simulations that allow workers to practice their work tasks, such as pilots attempting to improve their flight performance. This process may improve motivation by allowing workers to develop new skills that may only be developed in simulation due to excessive costs of attempting to develop those skills in real life, such as practicing jet takeoffs in uniquely challenging contexts, or burning excessive amounts of fuel in the process. Developing greater skill variety, a core job dimension in job characteristics theory, in turn leads to the critical psychological state of experience meaningfulness, and consequently increased motivation. Moreover, by allowing for new opportunities for growth in different domains through simulation exercises, gamification may aid motivation according to the Herzberg two-factor model of motivation. Yet gamification in today's organizations is not just an example of a micro-strategy, but also an example of change, which is the next topic we'll consider in a motivational context. Wright, Christian, and Izett attempted to explain the positive relationships between public service motivation, organizational change efforts, and employee acceptance of change found in prior literature. The authors examined 2 studies for more in-depth explanations of the aforementioned positive correlation. The authors noted the only subcomponent of the construct of public service, motivation that predicted willingness to commit change, was the motive of self-sacrifice. The authors suggested this relationship is the result of those being most motivated to sacrifice as being more likely to put the preferences of the organization more broadly in front of their own desires. We looked at a variety of theories of motivation, as well as their synthesis with various theories of interest from organizational psychology. My hope is this video has been informative, as well as that the importance and relevance of motivation to organizational psychology is clear from both theoretical and applied points of view. Thank you.